or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, how Floridians feel about eliminating everything from taxes to vaxes. We discuss the results of a new UNF poll released this morning, including an early snapshot of the governor's race. Then, an attempted assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine that had not been previously reported. We talked to the journalist who revealed the story. And a local combat veteran shares his recovery story and sets the pace for the upcoming Wounded Warriors Project 5K. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after today's news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Corva Coleman. President Trump is in Japan, where he met the country's newly installed prime minister today. The two leaders signed an agreement on rare earth minerals, although a final deal is still being worked out. Trump also spoke to U.S. troops stationed near Tokyo. He says a Japanese automaker is going to expand in the U.S.
Toyota is going to be putting auto plants all over the United States to the tune of over $10 billion.
Trump next goes to South Korea for an economic summit. The president says he'll meet Chinese President Xi Jinping while he's there. Premiums for Affordable Care Act health plans in the U.S. are set to jump sharply next year. That's unless Congress takes action. This is a key demand of Democratic lawmakers. They're demanding that Republicans restore funding for the health programs before they will sign on to spending legislation to end the nearly month-long federal government shutdown. NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin reports health policy experts worry many young and healthy people will end up dropping their health insurance coverage.
Chloe Chalicani is 31 years old and runs a small culinary business with her partner in Midcoast, Maine. She says she's already at her limit, paying $460 a month for an ACA plan. So if the premium gets more expensive,
I don't plan to get insurance next year.
Health policy experts warn that healthy people leaving insurance markets can lead to something called a death spiral, where only the most sick and oldest people participate. Open enrollment is coming up on November 1st. There are currently no signs of progress on this issue in Congress. Selena Simmons-Duffin, NPR News, Rockland Harbor, Maine.
More than 100 lawyers who held leadership roles at the Justice Department are condemning the agency's case against former FBI Director James Comey. NPR's Carrie Johnson reports the attorneys in the bipartisan group say they're coming together because they are worried about the rule of law.
The unusual group includes former attorneys general and their top deputies. They're speaking with one voice to warn about the prosecution of former FBI Director Jim Comey. Their new friend of the court brief says that case appears to be motivated by President Trump's animosity and a dangerous exercise of the power to prosecute. Comey's pleaded not guilty to charges of misleading Congress. He's trying to get the case thrown out by arguing he's the target of a vindictive or selective prosecution. Carrie Johnson, NPR News, Washington.
Hurricane Melissa is crawling toward Jamaica in the Caribbean. Forecasters say its top sustained winds have increased again. They're now 180 miles per hour. Jamaican officials are pleading for people to go to shelters before the hurricane makes landfall. This is NPR.
Good morning. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's 9:04. County Road 2209 will officially open after 10 this morning in St. Johns County. This new road will connect International Golf Parkway to Silverleaf Parkway. The $32.5 million four-lane road is designed to improve traffic flow in the northern part of the county. This 4-mile road includes a new sidewalk and a 12-foot wide multi-purpose path. Officials in the town of Palm Beach are pushing to change new year-round no-fly zone restrictions over President Trump's Mar-a-Lago club. The Federal Aviation Administration recently banned aircraft within 1 mile of the estate 24/7, whether the president's there or not. Wilkin Brutus has been following the rule change and says the community is not happy.
The rule, which is in place through 2026, forces planes from Palm Beach International to reroute northeast, and that will bring new noise and pollution to nearby neighborhoods. The zones widens to 10 nautical miles when Trump is in town.
The Citizens Committee on Airport Noise will meet next month to address those concerns. Palm Beach officials say they're working with the FAA and Secret Service to find a balance between safety and the community impact. It's a bit chilly in Jacksonville right now. Temperatures in the lower 60s, and it'll stay relatively cool this afternoon. Highs reach the upper 60s for areas north of the I-10 corridor, and it'll be in the low to mid 70s for areas to the south. It will be cloudy today as well.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Lilly Endowment, a private foundation supporting NPR's coverage of religion and spirituality, and Jarl and Pamela Mohn, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, from vax mandates to tax rollbacks, a new poll from the University of North Florida's Public Opinion Research Lab takes the pulse of Florida residents. We ask political analyst Mike Binder for the takeaways. Later in the program, stunning new revelations about a planned contract killing of Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine. We get the history of this previous mystery. But first, a new poll just released this morning shows well over half of likely Florida voters say the most important problems are related to the economy, but fewer than half support eliminating property taxes. Here to help us break down the findings is Michael Binder. He runs the Public Opinion Research Lab at UNF, and he's a political science professor. Welcome back, Michael Binder.
Thanks for having me this morning.
So let's start with the economy stupid, as people like to say. It's the economy stupid, very much so in this poll. When you kind of tack together all of the economic-related items you asked about specifically, more than half of the respondents said, that item, that economic item was the most important.
Right, but it's not if you think back to it's the economy stupid, back in the James Carville days, it's housing stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And it's housing costs, which were kind of the number one issue, but right behind that are property insurance and then property taxes. They're all kind of in the low teens area. And I think that really speaks to a lot of the changes that we've seen here in Florida. We've all seen the property insurance problem skyrocket. I'm sure everybody's on multiple insurers and seen their premiums double and triple in the last couple of years. And of course, if the housing market, just getting into it is almost impossible nowadays with some of the prices. Yeah. It's difficult. And all of this stuff comes together, and the property tax story that's happening in Tallahassee that will be a big point of contention this legislative cycle. All these things are coming together, and that's really where the action's at here.
And so the cost of living and the cost of living in a house has been obviously a big issue, and it has been one of the animating reasons that the governor has been pushing for an abolishment or an elimination, at the very least, a big rollback of property taxes in the state. And you asked specifically about that as well. You wanted to know if people support the idea, and you kind of set up the question with an understanding that there would be impacts.
Right. So we didn't say, hey, do you want to get rid of property taxes? Sure, sign me up for that. We said, listen, this is about $40 billion, give or take, that goes toward funding police and schools. And still, 49% of people supported it, 43% opposed. Now, if this is going to end up on a ballot, something that we all learned in the fall of 24, you need to get to 60% in order for anything to pass. So this doesn't bode well for that. But if you kind of look underneath the hood a little bit, even Republicans, which are traditionally, you would think, more supportive of this, were 59 to 30. So they're still not quite over that 60% mark either. So it's there's support for it, but there is not really the overwhelming support that maybe some folks might think.
And it was interesting because when you broke down the number of people that you were polling that were homeowners versus renters, it skewed heavily towards homeowners. So you would sort of think that it would skew more heavily towards people who don't want to pay property taxes.
Right. And even more interesting to this, and this is something I found fascinating. A lot of these numbers, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I've been doing this for a while. You kind of know the public. Those that were over 65 were the least supportive age group of reducing the property tax.
Wow.
43 to 46, they were underwater. They were more opposed to eliminating property taxes. And we can talk about maybe why that might be, because that group is heavily Republican. But if you think about this, these folks, again, they're likely voters. They're paying attention. They might have a better understanding of the implications at the local level of what not being able to fund your police looks like, maybe not funding your school system, what that might look like, and what the alternatives might be, because that money's got to come from somewhere. I don't think that we're not going to have police and we're not going to have schools in Florida if something like this were to happen. So how does that get funded? What kind of fees get tacked on?
And we should say that this is a poll of likely voters, people who said they absolutely will or likely will vote. But when the ballot measures come, they don't necessarily have context. So
No.
the question that you're asking, like, hey, would you like to get rid of property taxes, might be a more naked question in a voting booth than it is in the poll.
Right. It might be a more naked question, but it also presumably there's going to be a campaign based around those issues on both sides, because there potentially are police unions and public service unions that might be on the short end that are going to mobilize against this, teachers unions that might mobilize against this, that sort of thing.
It is interesting. I mean, we talk about the economy because if you count healthcare as the top most pressing concern, as an economic issue, which I think for most people it is, between housing costs, property insurance, property taxes, just the overall economy / jobs, inflation, and healthcare, 63% of the population that you spoke to said that those are the most important issues, and they are all kind of hinging on
Money. If you have a whole lot of it, those problems are much less for you. If you don't, like the vast majority of us, those things are really a big issue. And, you know, we're talking in the midst of a government shutdown, circled around those Obamacare costs that are going to be skyrocketing for some folks. This becomes really tough. And when you think about, you know, Medicaid and what that looks like going forward, a reduction in people on that program, healthcare is going to be a big issue going into 26.
A bigger one. It was just on the front page of the New York Times Sunday about Florida's specific vulnerability to those rising Obamacare rates. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Mike Binder about the latest UNF Public Opinion Research poll. If you have comments or questions, you can join us on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also email comments or questions to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. So I want to ask about some questions that have to do with health. You asked about vaccine rollbacks, which the Florida Surgeon General, not the Attorney General, the state Surgeon General has said that he wants to eliminate vaccine mandates for school kids. So you asked about support for that, and then you also asked some questions about trust, whether it had to do with the Secretary of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., or medical professionals. Help us kind of understand what you were asking about.
Yeah, so we did a variety of different things. Obviously, the first one is just a straight policy question about whether or not you support eliminating the vaccine mandates. And I don't know, surprising or not, but it was 63 to 34 against kind of everybody. People are supportive of the vaccine mandates writ large. We then also asked some favorability about RFK, but then we also asked these questions. You know, do you generally trust what this person is saying to be mostly true? When they misspeak, it's kind of mistaken, or are they telling you mostly lies? And unsurprisingly, you know, Democrats think Trump is telling you mostly lies. Republicans say he's mostly telling the truth. But even amongst those that think that medical professionals are telling you mostly lies, they are still more supportive of maintaining vaccines than getting rid of the vaccine mandate, which is interesting, right? If scientific professionals are you believe that they're telling you mostly lies, but you're still supportive of keeping vaccine mandates. I think that says something about this particular issue, and maybe it might not be the most popular issue that some folks might think it is.
And so you found in respondents that when it came to trusting medical research, that 47% believed it was mostly true, 20% believed it was mostly mistaken, and 17% believed it was mostly lies. But to your point, that even among those people who believed that those
Mostly lies, they're still supportive of maintaining vaccine mandates.
in terms of immigrant policy, that's been another obviously, heavily covered topic. People have very strong opinions on it. And you basically were asking approval. Do you approve or disapprove of the immigration policies under the Trump administration?
Yeah, and it was 54 to 44. And if you notice, that gets real close to 100%. A lot of the other polling questions that we ask about, there's a lot of don't knows or people that aren't sure. People have pretty clear feelings on attaching Trump to immigration.
Interesting.
And obviously, the last year has seen Trump and immigration side by side, hyping that up as an issue. And all of the things that have sprung from that, whether it's alligator Alcatraz here in Florida or everything that we've seen on the news across the country. And again, that, we're a Republican state. So it would make sense to me that, more Republicans are more supportive of this and we have more of them. So they're more in favor of Trump's immigration policies.
And how did you find that it's split in terms of urban versus rural, North versus South Florida? I mean, there are some differences in when you break it down on those levels.
Yeah, there are. And again, right, the unsurprisingly, the North was more supportive. They were, up over 60%. The South was a little bit less supportive. And in fact, 40% strongly oppose Trump's immigration policies in South Florida. And if you think about what that looks like and, Miami and some of the stories that we've seen come out of Miami, even though Cubans writ large are in favor of stricter immigration policies, when you look around and see your neighbor who's been there for 30 years get scooped up and taken away, suddenly it hits you a little bit differently. And I think we're seeing some of that.
In addition to issues, you looked at some political races that we will be hearing a lot more about in the next year, particularly governor. So first of all, how did you decide who to include and who not to include? I ask with a particular eye to Paul Renner, because he's going to be on this program Thursday.
Former Speaker of the House has raised a fair chunk of money.
But you didn't include him in this poll.
We didn't include him in this poll, and one was because it's not a Republican primary. So we're doing head-to-heads in the midterm election, so we're worried about November. And we polled back in the summer before Renner announced, and Casey and Byron Donalds were far and away the leaders. Polling on Republican primaries since then has shown that even when he has been included, he's been polling much lower. There's, about a dozen names that have either filed or have been rumored to file, maybe Jay Collins or Casey DeSantis or something like that aren't actually in the race. We can't include all of them because it's just too much. So we went with the two folks most likely to be at the top of the polls for the Republican primary, who were Casey DeSantis and Byron Donalds.
And so what did you find in terms of you're pitting them, as you said, this isn't a primary you're looking at. You're not pitting them head to head. Does the poll results that you got in terms of how they fare against Democrats tell you anything about which of those, if Casey DeSantis were to throw her hat in the ring, might be doing better?
I think this is probably the most backwards but most interesting finding. We put both Casey and Byron up against Jerry Demings and David Jolly. And for all four of those races, the Republican was up 12 to 14 points. It doesn't really matter. If you're a Republican and you're up against one of those Democrats, you're a double-digit favorite at this point. And I don't know that changes unless somebody who is particularly toxic gets into the race on the right, or somebody that is particularly charismatic with a lot of resources can touch people and reach people on the left. Outside of that, this looks like a double-digit race.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to ask you, what is sufficient to move the needle in a race if nothing happens?
If nothing happens, I think nothing happens. And I think we're staring at a double-digit, 10 to 15 point, depending upon turnout, lookout. But things can happen. And, it's not entirely clear what's going to happen this legislative cycle. What happens in Tallahassee in January? Things got pretty toxic last time. But again, only people that are really paying attention are following the nitty gritty of Tallahassee. But if something bad comes out of that, more Hope Florida stuff, or somebody gets arrested, or somebody gets in a drunk driving accident, right? Like there's a number of things that can happen in life that can change things. But if nothing happens, nothing's going to happen.
Right. And when you talk about Hope Florida Foundation and the investigation and the grand jury investigation that's underway into that charity that's associated with Casey DeSantis, it's not just her as a potential political candidate that it could impact. The Attorney General, Uthmeier,
right,
or Uthmeier,
yeah,
is very connected to that issue because he was running the.
Yeah, he ran the PAC that funneled the money, right? So yeah, and even in his race, we put him in there against Rodriguez, and it was he's kind of in that like 9, 10, 11 point range depending upon, and that's where everybody is. Moody is at the same thing for her Senate race. And that's really just a function of the makeup of the electorate at this point. And a lot of folks don't really know who he is for good reason, right? Nobody knows who the Attorney General is. Nobody knows who the governor's chief of staff is. Your regular voters, they're not paying attention every day. Yes, there are absolutely political junkies probably listening to your show that know these people intimately. But when you start thinking about the electorate writ large, they're going to find out about these people over the summer as the campaigns heat up.
Sure. I mean, even in your polling about, the president, there's some people that say, I'd never heard of him, right? I mean, there's always some, contingent that even the most prominent people will not have actually been following or have heard of.
Right. I mean, most people have heard of Trevor Lawrence, but there's a lot of people that have no idea who that is.
Right. Exactly. So in terms of the candidates, that was, we mentioned Ashley Moody, who is running for Senate, and you kind of laid out, it's a similar setup there for her. When it came to questions of honesty, I'm curious, first of all, why you chose to tackle this, because you didn't just ask about, what a lot of people, think about the honesty of elected officials, but you were looking also at whether people, not just institutions and media institutions.
Yeah, and so I think this is a little bit behind the curtain. We do a lot of things for a lot of different reasons, and one of the reasons we do things is research at the university. We are a university after all, and we wanted to be able to validate different methodologies. And while vote choice is one thing and support for a particular candidate is another thing, there are a variety of different ways to assess what people think and how they're communicating with you to identify if the people that you're speaking to are representative of the population that you're interested in. So for this particular survey, we did a lot of phone calls, right? Everybody we talked to on the phone, we pulled it from the voter list. That's our methodology. Well, there's other ways that you can reach people. You can text people. You can send people emails. We wanted to see, aside from the interest of just this honesty issue, do those other metrics measure up to the way that things are on the phone? And if they're different, how are they different? And why are they different? What does that mean? That's ongoing research kind of behind the scenes. But for the public-facing stuff, there's been so much talk of lack of a trust in media over the last few years. But that's bled into other institutions as well, right? Scientific researchers, religious leaders. You can go back to the 80s with, Jim and Tammy Faye, right? But these are things that I think are fascinating, and to see where people sit on these issues and how that relates to everything else.
Do you see that as part of just an overall erosion of trust? I mean, is that what the numbers tell you?
They do. Yes, people are saying, yeah, it's mostly true or mistaken for a lot of these institutions. And like you would expect, right? Republicans think Fox News is better than CNN, and Democrats think CNN is better than Fox News. But religious leaders, for instance, they only came in at 60%. 20% said they didn't know. Now, is that a function of these folks not being particularly religious and not paying attention? Well, if that's the case, what's that say, right? I mean, and those are things that, you have to think about what our society looks like today, how we transmit information, and what the implications for that are. 50 years ago, there were 3 television stations and a couple of local newspapers and a couple of local radio stations, and everybody was dealing with the same set of facts. Now there's a million of everything, and nobody's dealing with the same set of facts. And what does that mean for us as a society? How do we reach agreement or not? Can't open the government up, those types of things.
Yeah, it is so interesting. There is no monoculture, got a couple comments. One from Tom on Facebook. He says revising the homestead exemption would be a better idea, I guess, opposed to property tax rollback. He's taxing income and taking income into consideration, in that it would help keep seniors and others with low incomes in their homes. Ricardo emailed, can Dr. Bender explain the disconnect between a pretty centrist population based on the issues he polls and a very Republican election results?
Yeah, and I think this is a function that you see across the country, not just in Florida. Oftentimes, districts are more of one party than another, and therefore the outcomes in those elections aren't determined in November. They're determined in a primary, and the people that vote in a primary tend to be extremists. And you see this on both sides of the aisle. So you tend to get an elected official body that's more extreme than everybody else. We've also been in a situation where, because we've had supermajorities of Republicans, and part of that is population, but part of that's gerrymandering. In Tallahassee, they've had supermajorities. They can do whatever they want. They don't care, and they don't need to care about what Democrats or independents think, because their seats are determined in August, and they're all Republicans. So really, it's what does Republicans think, and then what do Republicans think that maybe are more likely to vote in a primary. That's where their electoral threat is, and that's who they're responsive to.
When it comes to choosing questions, what is the selection process? How do you decide what you're going to focus on? And I noticed in the addendum to this poll, there are a couple of questions that were sort of sponsored by interest groups, including one about euthanasia. So how do you work those into the mix? Who's eligible to kind of ask if they can have a question in your polling process?
Yeah, so it's a multi-step process. So one, we do these, a couple times a year, and we work with a lot of faculty members and we work with students. So if faculty members have questions that kind of fit the theme of the survey that we're doing at a given time, sometimes they're statewide. As you know, sometimes we do local ones here in Jacksonville. And then it's a matter of, okay, what do we think are the big issues? So this is, going into January, what's going on in Tallahassee? Obviously, property tax and vaccines are at the top of the, so those kind of make the cut. And then we have relations with a lot of different folks, whether it's media organizations or other entities. And sometimes they'll reach out and they'll want to do polls, and we do polls for people. But sometimes they don't have the resources to sponsor an entire poll.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes a policy issue that fits with the theme that we're working with, right? So you mentioned the medical aid in dying question. That's an organization that reached out to us. They didn't have the resource for an entire survey, but it's also an issue that got voted on in Tallahassee last year, right? That was a bill that was introduced in session. And I think there's a lot of value in bringing to light bills that are getting introduced in session, because a lot of time legislatures don't know where the public sits on this. They know where lobbyists sit on it, interest groups, donors, but not everybody else. So that was an opportunity for us to kind of bring that issue up. And, it was 63-28 support having an opportunity for medical aid in dying, after you reach a bunch of thresholds.
Right. We're about to be overwhelmed by polls ahead of the midterm elections, national, local.
Maybe less local, because Duval's not on the ballot, but
statewide.
But even statewide, I don't think we're going to see nearly the amount of polls as we used to see,
because
we're less competitive.
I gotcha. I mean, even saying that, when we're looking at polls, what are the statistically reliable ones? What should people be looking for? What polls should we trust?
So I think the short answer is name recognition. Have you heard of them? Are they clear about their methodology? Can you easily find who they contacted, how they contacted? What does that sample look like, right? Is it full of all Democrats? Is it full of all Republicans? Is it reflective of what the population looks like? Those are important. And then the methodology, because that can tell you some things. Is it a phone poll? Is it an online poll? Is it a text message poll?
And to those three questions, do you trust online polls?
I trust some. But again, that kind of margin of error in my mind increases, particularly political ones, because the people that are more likely to participate in those tend to be a little bit more technology progressive. That tends to correlate with maybe being more progressive on other issues. So even if you're getting Republicans in those type of polls, they tend to be more moderate type Republicans and less kind of Trumpy Republicans. So you can get misleading results on some of those.
What is next for the lab, the university lab, the public opinion research
Well,
lab?
we're undergoing some physical construction right now. In the next month or so, we'll be reopened and we'll have, we'll increase the size of our seats by about 50%. Got a nice new paint job in there. And, so there's a lot going on, and, the future brings transition and excitement. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, Dr. Bender, it is always great to talk to you. Thanks for doing the poll. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Up next, an aborted assassination attempt of Martin Luther King Jr. We talked to the reporter behind new revelations about the St. Augustine murder plot. Welcome back. Well, last week, a New York-based journalist who's originally from St. Augustine reported a stunning story about a failed assassination attempt on Martin Luther King Jr. in 1964. Hamilton Nolan joins us now via video to tell us the story and how he first learned about it. Hamilton, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ann.
It's great to have you back. So last week, you published a story on your Substack, How Things Work, and it's called The Time That Martin Luther King Jr. Was Almost Assassinated in St. Augustine, Florida. It's sort of an offhand way to reference something monumental, but it kind of reflects how you learned about it. Tell us about how you first heard this story.
Yeah, it's a great story. And, I don't want to pose as too much of an investigative reporter on this, because the way that I know about this is that my dad, David Nolan, is a local historian in St. Augustine and probably the world's leading expert on the civil rights history of St. Augustine. So I have been hearing stories from my dad my entire life about the time that Martin Luther King was in St. Augustine and all of the crazy events that surrounded that. So one thing that stood out to me when he told me this story was that I had never heard this story before, and also that it seemed like a historic enough story that everyone should know about it. And the story is basically that in 1964, when the civil rights protests were happening in St. Augustine, Martin Luther King came to St. Augustine. There was a lot of violence. Martin Luther King said St. Augustine was one of the most lawless cities he'd ever seen. But during the time that he was in St. Augustine, a leader of the local civil rights protests in St. Augustine was a Black dentist named Dr. Hayling. And Dr. Hayling's office was a meeting place where they had a lot of strategy meetings during those civil rights protests. Martin Luther King hung out there in Dr. Hayling's office a lot, and a lot of the local white racists knew that. And my dad heard this story from a woman named Cat Twine, who was a well-known figure in Lincolnville and St. Augustine. He called her the Rosa Parks of St. Augustine, and she witnessed this incident. And so Dr. King was in Dr. Hayling's office, and a man walked in, a white man, and that man was named Buddy Huff. And Buddy Huff was a kind of local character who owned a tourist attraction called the Tragedy in U.S. History Museum, which was actually right down the street from where I grew up. Kind of an unpopular, offbeat, sort of strange little tourist attraction. But Buddy Huff walked into this office where Dr. Hayling and Martin Luther King were standing, and he had a gun in his hands. And he walked up to Martin Luther King and he said to him, "I came here to kill you today, but I can't do it because I can see that you are a God-sent man." And then he turned around and walked out of the office and did not kill Martin Luther King that day. But, one of the many mind-blowing things to me about this story is that if he had, in fact, pulled that trigger, the entire course of 20th century U.S. history could have potentially been different. I mean, this was 1964, years before King was eventually assassinated. St. Augustine and the Tragedy in U.S. History Museum could have been as famous as Memphis and the Lorraine Motel and all of the things that actually ended up happening to King. So it was such a mind-blowing story and very little known story, a story that my dad knows and maybe a handful of other people know, but I think is really not widely known in America or even in St. Augustine. And I think that it should be.
It's interesting because obviously, your dad is, as you say, the foremost authority on civil rights history in St. Augustine. And it's been on his shoulders in large part that story has been told at all. There's a lot of people that credit him with bringing to life histories, people, events that happened in St. Augustine that the city had done its best to elide or brush over, in large part because it was a pretty ugly chapter in city history, and in no small part because a lot of the people that were involved on the wrong side of history were still around.
That's right. And that's another thing I've been hearing about my whole life. My dad moved to St. Augustine late 70s, I guess. And so he's been researching this stuff for essentially the whole time he's been in St. Augustine and spent many, many years and decades trying to get the city to promote this side of its history. But it was very true that, the same people who were standing at the plaza in downtown St. Augustine beating up the civil rights protesters didn't leave town after the Civil Rights Act passed. Those people were there. And in many cases, they were kind of the good old boys who were very much woven into like the power structure of the city of St. Augustine. And so definitely one of the reasons why St. Augustine for many, many years did not promote its civil rights history is that the sort of villains of civil rights history in St. Augustine were still around. And it was a very long struggle, I think, by my dad and many others in St. Augustine to try to get the city to recognize that part of its history, which it has done to at least to a large degree now. There's a Freedom Trail, there's statues, there's historic markers. So you can go to St. Augustine now and see that civil rights history that a lot of which was uncovered by my dad and other activists in St. Augustine. But yeah, it was not an easy road to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, and worth saying that as recently as the late 90s, that those markers that mark all of these really significant spots in civil rights history weren't there. If you're just joining us, I'm talking to journalist and author Hamilton Nolan about his recent story about a previously unreported murder attempt on Martin Luther King Jr. in St. Augustine. If you have any comments or questions, you can give us a call at 904-549-2937, or you can email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also reach out on social media on Instagram, Facebook, or X at FCC On Air. So, Hamilton, I just want to touch a little bit on the tragedy in U.S. History Museum, because that is, you mentioned Buddy Huff. He was the owner of this strange institution that was right near the Fountain of Youth. And it was there for a number of years, and it had a very strange collection of items, including, allegedly the car that Jane Mansfield died in. And I think I personally sat in the ambulance that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly went to the hospital in. But one of the things in this kind of strange collection was a really remarkable set of papers that belonged to a pretty virulent racist in St. Augustine.
Yeah, that man's name was Haas Manussi, and he was kind of the leader of the white racist resistance to the civil rights protests in the 60s. And, the tragedy in U.S. History Museum, people who did not have the good fortune to go there, was sort of not one of the top tier tourist attractions in St. Augustine. It was kind of the thing that is now featured in like weird roadside attractions type books and stuff like that. As you said, it was very hard to tell what was actually authentic in the museum. There was a wax figure of Lee Harvey Oswald in the front window. There was allegedly Jane Mansfield's death car. There was allegedly Bonnie and Clyde's death car. I think there were a lot of items associated with Lee Harvey Oswald. There was some medieval torture equipment in the backyard. So kind of a strange little museum that this guy had just assembled himself in his house, basically. But he did, in fact, get Haas Manussi's papers when Haas Manussi died. And my dad, for obvious reasons, had a lot of interest in those papers because they were pretty key to the other side of the civil rights struggle in St. Augustine. And I think that he tried to obtain those papers from Buddy Huff unsuccessfully.
We've got a call from Mark in St. Augustine. Good morning, Mark. Go ahead.
This is fascinating. I've never heard this story before, and I'm just kind of curious. Has it ever been? Did Martin Luther King ever speak about it publicly? Is it in the historical record somewhere that you could look it up, or is this just? I mean, yeah, this could be totally made up by this Buddy Huff guy or your dad, for that matter of fact. I mean, has this ever been mentioned? Was it reported? Did the police get involved? Anything like that?
Thanks for the call, Mark. I mean, a couple of things we should say that there were other known attempts on his life in St. Augustine, including the famous picture that we were just showing for those watching our live stream of the bullet hole that was in the building that he was staying at the time. And your father's a fairly unimpeachable source when it comes to local civil rights history. But, you know, to his point,
Yes.
there's not really a record of this as far as we know.
Right. Now, my dad had two sources on this story, like a good journalist. He had Cat Twine, who, again, was a very well-known activist in St. Augustine and who witnessed the event. And he also told this story on some tours that he would give of the Lincolnville neighborhood. And one year when he told this story, after the tour, an elderly white woman came up to him and said to him, "I was Buddy Huff's nurse at the end of his life, and Buddy Huff told me the same story." And so it's at least a double source story with an eyewitness, which is pretty good. And I think that, you know, my impression is that, as you said, my dad kind of filed this story along with all the other violent attempts on Martin Luther King that happened while he was in St. Augustine. I think my dad kind of see it as part and parcel of, you know, a series of violent acts against Martin Luther King. But, you know, it jumped out at me just because of how close this man actually came to changing history that day.
Yeah. And, you know, speaking to the violence that existed at that time, I mean, you mentioned Hasmanusi, you know, he ran a club that was, I perhaps euphemistically called the Ancient City Hunting Club, which claimed 1,500 members. And this was a time when the membership of that club was essentially deputized by the sheriff, A.L. Davis, during protests. And so these were essentially, you know, avowed racists who were given law enforcement powers to enforce during protests, during which they were openly and kind of wantonly attacking young Black protesters.
Right, essentially an army of racist thugs with guns who were on the same side as law enforcement at that time. I mean, think about what it means for Martin Luther King in 1964 to say, "This is the most lawless town that I've been to." You know, this is Martin Luther King speaking in 1964. He's seen a lot of lawlessness, and St. Augustine was at the top of his list. You know, protesters were beat up at the beach. They tried to integrate a swimming pool downtown, and the owner famously tried to dump acid into the pool while the protesters were in there. So St. Augustine was famous for being violent and racist and lawless. And that is, again, a side of its history that the town doesn't like to talk about so much, but it's a fact.
Well, Hamilton Nolan, it's an extraordinary story. I'm glad that you've got it on the record. You can find a link to his story on our website and also on Hamilton Nolan's Substack. It's called How Things Work. Hamilton, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ann.
All right, up next, a local combat veteran shares his recovery story and sets the pace for the upcoming Wounded Warriors Project 5K. Welcome back. After being seriously wounded by an IED blast while serving in Afghanistan, my next guest found himself on an entirely new path. His recovery has been marked by intense physical and mental health challenges, but also by inspiring accomplishments. Here to tell us more is former Army Sergeant Sean Karpf. Thanks so much for being here, Sean.
Well, thank you so much.
So you enlisted in 2007, and I've seen that, in part you were inspired by your uncle, but based on the timing, I'm guess probably also in part by 9/11?
Yeah, definitely. I was a sophomore when 9/11 happened. So
In high school.
yes. And so it's that definitely had an impact, but in 2007, the housing market started taking a dive, and having a 1 and a 3-year-old at the time and just trying to survive at a young age. I was 19 when I had my daughter. So like having 2 kids and then going from working 40 hours a week to not knowing where, my next hours were going to come, if they were going to come, really pushed me into like survival mode. And so that pride in wanting to join the military is, what led me to go and join.
Yeah. And you were a infantry paratrooper. You served with the 82nd Airborne, and you were in Afghanistan. This was about 2012, I believe, when your injury occurred.
Yes, 2012, June 15th, 2012.
Okay. Tell us what happened.
So on a dismounted patrol, I was a weapons squad leader. So I was in the back of the formation, and we were walking on a narrow path, and on either side of us, there was water on either side. So we saw guys running on a rooftop probably 350 meters away from where we were at, and they called me on the radio and said, "Hey, bring your gun to the front. We see guys running on a rooftop, and they're setting in to attack us." And so I started making my way, and this path had already been cleared, and so not thinking anything of it, it already had the mine detector out front. So I just started walking with my gunner and the medic, and stepped on a improvised explosive device, and only 25% of that 5-pound or that 5-gallon jug went off, and so. After initial blast, now they have to get me out of there and get me medevaced out. And so, like I said, there was water on either side. So they put me on a litter, carry me to the other side of the water. And then we hear the medevac coming in to land. And once the medevac landed, as soon as it landed and my guys started taking me over to get in the medevac, the guys that were on that rooftop opened fire and started shooting at the helicopter. So they waited for that helicopter to land. And so the medevac had to pick up and leave. And now I'm strapped to a litter, and the guys that were with me are now in a firefight for 5 minutes with the guys on the rooftop. And so then a small gunship came, and a gun started doing gun runs on the building, and then the medevac was able to come in and land and get me out of there.
And I should say, I appreciate you sharing this story, and I should have prefaced it by saying, if I know that that's a difficult thing to share. So thanks for, reminding us how the injury happened. Your recovery is a remarkable story. We're going to have to take a short break. So we'll take a break. We'll come back in just 2 minutes on the other side. If you're just joining us, we are talking to Sean Karpf. He is a Army veteran working with wounded warriors, and we'll be back in just a couple minutes.
Amelia Island celebrates the annual Dickens on Center Christmas Market, December 11th through 14th. Experience a Victorian Christmas festival featuring holiday entertainment, festive food and drink, St. Nick and Enchanted Village, holiday shopping, and more. Info at ameliaisland.com/Dickens. The Florida Forum Speaker Series, benefiting Wolfson Children's Hospital, welcomes professional basketball player Caitlin Clark, October 29th at the Jacksonville Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets and information at thefloridaforum.com.
On the next Fresh Air, Judd Apatow. His new book, Comedy Nerd, is filled with never-before-published photos, handwritten letters, and early script drafts. He'll share some related memories, including the childhood obsessions that led to comedies like The 40-Year-Old Virgin and Freaks and Geeks. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Young Americans are taking their own lives at a much higher rate than a decade ago, up 20% for people 18 to 27.
To be able to transition from my purpose being school to what is my purpose now as a more independent individual is so complicated and becoming more complicated.
Why is it happening? That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
President Trump's second term has been marked by a dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy. He has imposed tariffs, suspended foreign aid, and sent mixed signals on ending the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, freedom around the world has continued to decline for the 19th year in a row. That's according to a recent study. Autocracy and democracy around the world. Next time on 1A.
Today starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I've been speaking to former Army Sergeant Sean Karp. He is a combat wounded veteran. He was sharing his story of how he became injured when he was serving in Kandahar, Afghanistan. Sean, so you after this very dramatic rescue, you were flown to Germany and, had kind of medical care initially there. Then you went to Walter Reed, which is, a common place for military folk to recover. But that was, many months and many surgeries. How do you track when, I guess, your recovery began? Was it a physical process? Was it more when you were on the other side of the sort of physical recuperation?
So from the very beginning, I definitely think I have a high tolerance for pain, and so it wasn't the physical aspect of everything. It was more the mental. Right before I got injured, I just re-enlisted for 6 more years and thought that's what I was supposed to do. Do 20 years, and I love being in the military. So getting injured and then leaving my squad behind was the harder part of it, and just not being there, because you feel like the father figure when you're molding these young men, and to get pulled off the battlefield and leave them behind, that was the hard part. And I remember like reading messages and stuff like that, like when I was at Walter Reed, and just sending messages back. I remember sitting in the room with my wife, just crying, and that, like, to me, that was the hard part, not like the injury, putting a prosthetic on every day, like that's the easy part. It's always been the mental struggles.
And you also suffered, it may go without saying given the fact that you endured that IED blast, but you suffered a traumatic brain injury. And, the mental component of recovering from that experience alone can be an enormous challenge, even without residual PTSD. But all of that kind of works together and makes a very difficult path in some cases.
Oh, yeah. And especially having young kids, and dealing with PTSD and the TBI, like it changes the way your chemistry in your brain is, and like to go from a happy dad to somebody that just struggles with just your kids are jumping around playing because they're young, just being kids, and like you're getting angry, like that wasn't normal. So I knew right off the bat like something wasn't right, and that's so it's hard. Like, and when I talk to people about being a wounded warrior, I do touch more on the mental aspect of it because being like I'm very proud and having that pride, and like I don't want to admit my flaws, and so like having that, like I can't control it, and trying to work through that process has been for me the hardest aspect of this whole journey. And so now when I see other wounded warriors going through those similar instances, now I can have that empathy towards them, and be able to like share my experiences, share where I've been at my low and where they can see themselves in the future of being able to grow and work on those things.
And so your work with Wounded Warriors Project, I mean, you've been doing it now for, many years. And in fact, you're going to be leading this upcoming 5K, which is a national event, but there's a local component here in Jacksonville. How does that allow you to connect with others, or to just sort of represent for individuals like yourself, who might be needing services or might be needing assistance?
And that's the beauty of having a physical injury that people can see, because you go out to these runs, there's people that you don't, those invisible wounds that people can't see, that are dealing with things that are far greater than I can ever imagine. And just being able to sit there and talk to them, and they come up to me and like, oh man, you're such an inspiration. And I'm like, this person right next to me is inspiration to me. So like having that physical injury enables those conversations to get started, and just being honest to myself and be able to like tell people where my flaws are, and where where you can better yourself, and it opens up those doors to have those relationships with other veterans.
Well, Sean, it is a pleasure to meet you. Thanks a lot for sharing your story today. Thanks for the work that you did. And we should say the Carry Forward 5K is November 8th. Registration starts for that at 6:30 in the morning, and an opening ceremony is at 8. You can find more information on our website or at carryforward.woundedwarriorproject.org. Sean Karp, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much.
All right, and thank you for listening. Join us tomorrow when we discuss efforts to save the historic Drew Mansion in Springfield. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
On the First Coast, the records keep spinning. Anthology 89.9 HD3 delivers the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Songs you know by heart. Anthology 89.9 HD3.